We're about to begin a voyage in space and time and eternity. This is the opening quote, one of the opening quotes from Huston Smith. I got this for you, Christian. In his book, um,
World
on world
religions.
religions. Exactly. So we're going to be using this book as sort of a guide, and then we'll be working through some classic texts as well. So the idea is to cover uh, the, ma- the major world religions through a series of videos, discussion, classic texts, etc. So, but that is the opening quote. I like that one. We're about to begin a voyage in space, in time, and eternity.
It's a good
So,
quote.
yeah, we read two chapters, but it looks like we're going to talk about chapter one, which is called Point of Departure, which essentially sets up Houston Smith's approach um, to thinking about and explaining the world religions,
Hmm.
which obviously we can discuss. And then we're going to be starting in with Hinduism, which is chapter two. We will most likely not finish it and continue with
Yeah,
Hinduism in the next chapter.
there's a
That is
lot
to
in
say,
Hinduism.
Houston. Yeah, that is to say, Houston's introduction
Hmm.
to Hinduism. We'll have to spend another session on. Um, so, point of departure.
Point of departure.
Point of departure. Um, I'll talk about the first two pieces that I thought were of interest. One, he addresses life's ultimate questions. I know in philosophy these have been summarized as um, uh, who am I, where am I, uh, how do I know, and then what should I do, which
Hmm.
really covers all of the different branches of philosophy. So the ultimate questions, the biggest questions that we can fundamentally ask, and then he does an interesting spin. I mean, these are perennial questions, right? They don't die. But then he does an interesting spin on the introduction of modern science,
Hmm.
where which I think is a valuable point because you have modern science breaking in to the world, not just the Western world, but to the world, but in the West, like in the 1600s, and then as a framework and model. Uh, it obviously its explanatory power is great. However, it only really covers that which is empirically verifiable and really can't touch these questions fully.
Hmm.
But we
Right.
can we can tease that out. Meaning, in other words, like, does that make sense to you, Christian? That the scientific method, though valuable for understanding, empirical knowledge, one, and two, connected to technological development, which is more of a practice,
Yeah.
um, very important things, but can't quite grasp or answer the ultimate questions because he makes that claim.
No, I think that's true. It's it's a very descriptive thing, so you can only
Hmm.
describe what what's around you.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of these questions go beyond descriptions of reality,
yep,
and
yep.
especially when you're dealing with like, why are we here? Like, what are we
Hmm.
doing?
That's
Um,
huge.
you can't just look to the world around you and be like, oh, yep, that's what I'm supposed to do.
Precisely.
I
Right.
mean,
I get yeah, go
unless
ahead.
I feel like maybe it was like Elon Musk who said this, or some scientific person was their goal is to just answer why. Like, why is everything the way that it is? And so it's just knowledge seeking in that sense. And so science can serve that if that's your approach.
Yeah, and the one limitation will be it's only that which is observable
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
measurable, right? So if there are things that are outside that purview, then it's not going to reach it,
Hmm.
right? Right? Because I mean, we could. I mean, for I guess if you were a scientific reductionist, then you would say there is nothing outside that purview. So
Right.
therefore, science is answering it all. But if there is something outside of that, then it won't. It won't reach it,
Right. Or that
right?
science should be able to reach those things, but it we might not know exactly how or when.
True, true. That's true. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say talked about this before, but I would say that the if you do have a spiritual dimension, and
Hmm.
spiritual literally defined as um, uh,
Non-physical.
yeah, non-physical, right? And non-extended in space,
Yeah,
non-observable. There's a question about how you get to it. But I
that's
want to
true.
I want to throw in something here too. I do think, especially with, and not to jump too far ahead, but I do think that with a little bit of what we've read in Hinduism and a little bit about what we will read in Buddhism, that there is that I'm sorry, that these, especially with the Raja Yoga, right? The Raja Yoga was the one that Houston really
It's the
unpacked.
experimental one at the end, the
Um,
royal one.
the royal one, right? And that you could argue, though that's not a scientific method, that is empirical, at least from the observer's perspective,
Yeah,
right? So, in
yeah,
other words, you're not just accepting the yogi in that context wouldn't just be accepting something on faith and saying, okay, great, I believe this, now I move along. No, it would be like I am literally experiencing
yeah. It's like,
through these experiments, right? Because he calls it an experimental
hmm
yoga. Uh, I'm I'm actually discovering that I am being itself, right? Through meditation and through various austerities and observations, you sort of like, so in that's, you know what I'm saying?
yeah, it's like a subjective scientific method,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Like,
Mhm.
because you can only base it off of what you are experiencing, but you
Yeah,
are experimenting on that. And so it's
true.
not like you are
However,
measuring something with something that everybody can agree upon.
true.
You're measuring something within yourself which you can't,
Yeah.
which might not
But at
translate to
this,
everybody.
yeah, but at the same time, you could extend it. Maybe let's say you have a lot of yogis,
Yeah, yeah, and there's
a lot
probably
of yogis that are,
definitely a lot of
you,
commonalities.
so you have a lot of yogis that are experimenting with that particular path, and then you have a conversation, and you're sort of like, oh yeah, I did that, yeah, and I was doing that meditation as well, and I
Hmm.
realized that. Oh, you realized that too. I mean, you can see sort of a, because obviously science is based on at some level a community,
Hmm.
right? So it's, and all these different scientists are, they have these findings and then they write about it, they compare it. There could be a communal element, but I would say from the it would be lacking, let's say, objectivity because it is something that's happening within the self,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm. Yeah.
That would be a distinction. Um, so yeah, that's I would say I vibe with the general approach that that it could be. Here's the whole point: if science can explain it all, then this book should be maybe more of like a interesting sociology of religion, right?
Well, I don't think science can
Whereas
explain
he's
it all, or at least
exactly, yeah,
it can't now with what we know,
yeah,
right? Like maybe
yeah,
if we
yeah.
determined that something like string theory was real, which adds
Hmm.
like 11, other dimensions to reality, then the spirit world can be encapsulated in those dimensions.
Yeah.
And we just don't know how to describe that. And so,
Hmm.
with what we know, which is like, a three-dimensional space-time world, um, we like anything outside of that we can't really measure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it's possible. Like we, plus a lot of religions gather from experience
Yeah.
and I should say spiritual practices as well, but
Sure.
gather from experience, whereas science really is focusing on something that everybody can agree on objectively. And so
Right.
I think even if science could get to the point where it could explain things that are spiritual or
Yeah.
religious, that it's going to be way behind what people are actually experiencing. Because in order for it to
Sure.
catch up to being able to describe that, and I think we even see that somewhat in like medicine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like Hinduism, there's all of these rituals and medicines that they had applied from
Hmm.
their knowledge and experience.
Hmm.
And right now, like um, our Western medicine is like catching up and slowly figuring out that, oh yeah, these things actually do
Right.
scientifically work
Right.
on
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
solving these medical issues, and it's just
Sure.
behind. It's behind by
Yeah. Yeah.
centuries.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
No. 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 I could see that. I could see that. Um. so then he talks about some of his well-defined themes, right? What he's gonna pretty much how he's approaching the book, like it's sort of like what's in, what's out, what's the general um, approach to the book. So what I got were he's looking at ideas. So it's like the sort of the big ideas within religion.
Yep.
Um, Also the leading perspectives. So because there are so many variations of any particular religion,
Hmm.
we're not going to hear about all of those. But of course, our own side research can tap into those, right?
Right.
And some of the books we'll be reading, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, obviously, that we're dealing with Tibetan Buddhism. So we look at some of the classics, we will dive into some of those variations. But
Hmm.
in terms of what we're getting in this guide, is sort of the leading perspectives. Um, Not the full story of religion, right?
Yeah.
It's primarily about values, so we're not getting all the horror, which he does admit, obviously, occurred in the history of religion. So
Yep.
it's the basic values that each religion is promoting. I mean, I'll just give you an example with what we read in Hinduism. Uh, he already outlines some moral precepts that are important. Uh, uh, the like just like one was like non-injury,
Hmm.
truthfulness, things like that, which I imagine we're going to find um, across all religions, sort of like some version of
Right.
the golden rule. So I think there will be a lot of moral similarities between them.
Hmm.
So values are going to be important.
Right.
Not a
And
compared, not yeah, go for it. Yeah.
like I think it's another specific example from the Hinduism section was on the caste structure. He
Yeah.
focuses on like the original intent for it and not what it has become
Hmm.
today, which is like this
That's a good one.
multi-level thing where you can't get out of your caste and I don't know. There's a like it's perverted from its original like essential form.
Sure, sure, exactly, exactly. And it could have been the case that even in its original form, it was questionable. I
That's fair.
mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily not necessarily the theological explanation for it, right? But maybe the practice of it,
Yeah. Well, it got to the point that it
how
is
it was
today, so at some point
right,
it was. Yeah.
right. Um, and then not comparative, so we're not doing the. I mean, you and I'll probably do the comparative, like, and I'm not saying the comparative in the sense of better, worse,
Right.
but more along the lines of, oh, is it this interesting? I already have one. Can I share it?
Sure.
Keep the conversation organic. Um, I thought that so jumping into Hinduism, I thought that the bhakti path was really
Hmm.
interesting
Yeah.
because
And
it
bhakti is the
sound
just for people who are listening is the emotional
the
bent one
emotion. Mhm.
for and it's like the idea is love and devotion. Those are kind of like the two main.
Love, exactly. Love
Hmm.
and devotion. And what I thought was really interesting about it, and I think our brains are just going to make these connections naturally, is it sounded a lot like um, the bhakti form, not the jnana form, but the bhakti form sounded a lot like
Hmm.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam,
Oh, absolutely.
where
Like God is
right,
distinct, separate.
God
You
is
pour your
distinct
love
and
into it.
separate.
Yep.
Right. There's a creator creature distinction, so you're not the same thing.
Hmm.
Sorry, in the Western tradition
Yep.
and or religions, and you are to love God, you are to adore God, right?
Yeah.
And so I was just like, this version sounds like that.
Definitely.
Vijana did not. The Raja, is it Raja or Raj?
Raja
I think it's
and the karma.
Raja.
Yeah.
The Raja yoga did not, and
No.
to a degree, because the karma yoga has two. It's sort of binary in its
Yeah.
approach. It has a little bit of that devotion. So I
Yeah.
think our brains are going to make those connections, like this uh, this this piece sounds a lot like what you see in another religion,
Definitely.
right?
Yep.
Um, so, although what's really interesting when we talk about bhakti is at its core, though it's not, right? metaphysics, like ultimately, it's really not a God that is separate from you,
Right.
right? But it's just that that orientation, the orientation of that path is such that you are giving all of your love to that God. So in a sense, it appears, I guess, distinct, whereas in reality there is no distinction between God and
Right.
human.
Yeah, it's easier to
So
give your love to others, like pour yourself out, than it is to
yeah,
like seeing your like if loving yourself is doesn't feel the same as loving other people unless you kind
correct.
of look at yourself as somebody else, right?
Hmm.
I feel like that like if you love yourself and you think of yourself as another, like as a friend, it's a
Hmm.
lot easier to love yourself than to, if you're thinking of yourself as yourself.
Yes,
Like it's
exactly.
a weird way
No, no,
to
no.
say it.
Exactly, exactly. And I think what ends up being, although what's interesting is that, and maybe we could do our own side research with the Bhakta yogi. Is there, or yoga? Sorry, is there? I wonder if some of the practitioners are so devoted to their love of God that don't. They're not even thinking about the deeper metaphysical connection between the Atman and Brahman,
Probably,
between their
yeah.
own self. You know, do you know what I'm
If
saying?
I mean, it also says it, you know, that the of the four yogas that it's not like there's one path that you go down. You kind of like
Right.
you're dealt a hand of cards, and like you're not entirely emotionally bent. You know, there's you fit into all of them, and so you need
Right.
to explore them to the degree that you can, that works for you. And so it's like maybe yeah,
Yeah.
somebody who is like fully emotional,
Yeah.
um, then they wouldn't think about the metaphysical. They would just like that's how they
Right.
that's how they become one with God is
I,
they
yeah.
love.
I'm also sort of imagining. I also wonder though whether or not it could be the case that if you have someone that is not very reflective in that is it bhakti or bhakta?
Bhakti. Yeah.
Is it bhakti?
Hmm.
Let me just get it right.
That's what I wrote
Yeah.
down.
Bhakti. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Whether is it the case that you could have someone practicing bhakti yogi that isn't very reflective, that basically has the idea of separateness?
Hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying? That God really is separate, sort of in the Western tradition, but and that wouldn't be a problem because ultimately they by devoting yourself to someone else selflessly, you are breaking down ego. So
Hmm.
even if your intention, even if you don't even aren't even thinking like, oh, that's right, Atman is Brahman, I am God, even if you aren't thinking that, the effect could very well lead to that. In other words, if you're thinking God is
Yeah.
separate and I'm devoting all my love to that, well then self decreases,
Yeah.
and that's certainly a theme, right, within the Hindu metaphysic, that you need to decrease the self in order uh, to to connect with the divine that is you.
Yeah. To achieve
So
moksha,
yes, liberation.
liberation.
Oh, it connected to three. I shared this quote with you before, but it's well worth quoting. I mean, this is one I'm just going to remember or memorize. And related to number three, so not the full story of religion, but
Hmm.
about values. Loved the quote. The biggest mistake religion made was getting mixed up with people. So,
Yes.
and that was sort of an institutional remark. And I actually think or recall, Christian, is that the institutional element is one of the things that you struggle with.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. No, the
Do you want to
metaphysical
comment
is
on that?
more interesting. I don't know.
We can get personal here.
Well, I feel like people aren't a good representation of what a religion is.
Mhm.
Um, that I mean, people are flawed, and so that's probably the biggest issue is that if you are basing your concept of religion based off of the people who embody that religion,
Mhm.
then there's going to be flaws, and that's it's like it's not ideal.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of things.
Well, sure. I mean, maybe that can come up later when we talk about Christianity and your experience
Yeah.
in it, right?
Hmm.
Um, but does some of it have to do with your experience within the institutional churches you were in, or no?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay. Cool. We'll hold that till Christianity hits.
We'll get there.
Or when it seems apt.
Yeah.
So, what the book is about seeks to embrace the world. So, look, we're going to be getting. I mean, I want to go back to our opening quote: "Voyage in space and time and eternity." So, we're going to be looking at all of these different cultures, right? And also, too, I like the word "embrace." I think Smith's approach is very gentle. I think it's
Yeah.
honest, like when he references the abuses of the caste system,
Hmm.
but generally speaking, it's avuncular. It's the uncle that's I've got you. I'm
Yeah.
covering you, and I'm not interested in disrupting or destroying or deconstructing you, right?
Yeah, it's really easy to read as well. It just
Yeah,
the way he
yeah,
writes just flows. It's very comforting.
yeah, yeah. We talked about this earlier. Just the
Hmm.
his tone, and a lot of it's the tone that he takes is a tone of respect and reverence for what
Yeah.
he's talking about, and that makes it easier to read it and understand it. So seeks to embrace the world, takes religion seriously. Um, that in the sense that these are, well, he actually talks about it like a religion that exists, a religion that's alive.
Mm.
There's a quote on page 14 about that. See, religion that's alive. Um, oh, yeah, yeah. It says it calls the soul, this is his own words, it calls the soul to the highest adventure it can undertake, a projected journey across the jungles, peaks, and deserts of the human spirit. Um, so we're not talking about something that's dead. He's not even writing about them in a way that um, well, obviously dry, so
Hmm.
he's looking at these as, actively, you know, passionately believed um, religions. Um, and then the book makes a real effort to communicate, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I think he even said like it's sort of he sees it as a work of translation,
Hmm.
right?
Translating concepts,
And
ideas.
yeah, in a clear way. Good quote, by the way, by Schrodinger. Do you see it there?
Yep.
You want to read that?
Uh, if you cannot in the long run tell everyone what you have been doing, your doing has been worthless.
It's
Yeah.
another one to commit to memory. Any other comments on the opening? I mean, we're sort of
Um,
you feel clear on his orientation to
yeah, I think, I mean, I don't, did you mention the first one, which is that it's not about history?
right, right.
Hmm.
I think we'll get a yeah. Actually it was funny. He really doesn't do that with Hinduism, right?
Nope. I mean, the
Like
only thing is like mentioning the differences between like the caste system then and now, and that was it. And that
yeah,
was just like
yeah,
a side comment.
yeah. No, in fact, the way he starts out with Hinduism is the whole question of what do people want. So he's not saying like, and
Yeah,
there
there's
was
no
this,
origin
ancient
story.
ancient
Hmm.
civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization, and that was dug up by archaeologists X, Y, and Z,
Right.
and these are its dates. I mean, interesting stuff, but that's not his engagement.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, it also makes it feel more dead
Oh,
if you're just
yeah,
analyzing it than
yeah,
asking the questions
exactly.
that the people are
Actually,
asking. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. Right. In other words, if it has that history of or sociology of, then it's almost sort of like a dead object that you're analyzing,
Yeah.
which is not his orientation, right?
Hmm.
So, all right, Hinduism. We've
Hinduism.
already referenced some stuff. You want to?
We have. So what do people want? Sounds like people want, they desire a lot of things. Well,
Yes, they do. They do.
they, Hinduism, it seems like there are four paths
Mhm,
that they see, and they kind of organize it in a certain way where there's the path of desire, and there's two
mhm,
ways through that, and then there's the path of renunciation, and there's two paths of that. But then three of those paths are considered finite, limited, and they
Mhm.
wear out over time. And then the
Yeah,
fourth path, which is in the path of renunciation, which is moksha or liberation,
right.
is beyond those finite desires and wants.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, we have the path of desire. So in that, there's pleasure and
Hmm.
success, and so those are the two things. What people want, they want pleasure and they want success.
Right,
Um, and then in the path of renunciation, there's community or duty, and then there's moksha and slash liberation.
right, right. So yeah, exactly. So yeah, right. The path of desire, path of renunciation, and I wrote, and maybe this. Well, I wrote the path of desire. Can you hear me? Okay, because it sounds like we have a gardener here.
Yeah, I can hear fine.
Okay, can you hear the buzzing or no?
No?
Oh, good, perfect. Um, with the path of desire, I wrote that it's ultimately trivial, and I mean ultimately in its,
Yeah.
in its sense of like in terms of ultimate concerns, right? Um, so it's not, it's, and this is really interesting too because you know, so I'm doing the 75-day hard challenge, and giving up vices, as it were, right?
Hmm.
And then including things I haven't done before, like a rigorous form of exercise and drinking a gallon of water, which by the way is insane. You want to quit drinking alcohol, drink a gallon of water because it's your only focus all day. How do I get a gallon in my belly? But what's interesting is that um, I think pleasure is just so dominant. Like
But
sometimes I think
you said
the
pleasure,
what's
or
that?
do you say desire, or would you say is dominant?
Pleasure, yeah,
Pleasure.
or
Hmm.
desire, yeah, yeah, is it's just it's so widespread in terms of a um, like an immediate sense of satisfaction, you know. And sometimes I think about like whether or not this is true about like all of human nature or particular cultures, um, but like I would say at core, a lot of us are hedonists.
Yeah.
Like we are apt at, and maybe not in the pure. Well, no, like, but we're after pleasure. We're seeking this, so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that, and I think we talked about this with Dietrich when we were discussing Augustine on the Road,
Hmm.
that the author of that book was saying that we, the only thing that ultimately will fill you is that which is infinite.
Yeah.
The only
Hmm.
thing that will ultimately fill holes and hungers is the infinite. And and I don't think he's just saying that. Like I think there's personal, subjective and maybe objective observations that can be made that whatever your pleasure is, you need to refill it. You constantly need to refill it, right?
Hmm. It drains. Yeah.
And it's never it's insatiable. It's never
Hmm.
satisfied fully. Um, so I don't know. It interests me. I mean, I think we sort of know that pleasure for the sake of pleasure is just not it. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to have something more. Um, and uh, and then you're right. The next sort of step up is success in itself. Not a bad thing, but
It's
as an
like
end,
it
it's
pushes the
problematic.
pleasure over time. I think that's the
Yeah,
main difference, right?
yeah.
Like they both fulfill desire, but pleasure is like immediate gratification,
Hmm.
whereas
Hmm.
success is delayed gratification. And
Yeah.
so,
No.
and I think if you follow these paths in order from pleasure, success, community, moksha, you kind of
Uh-huh.
you're pushing it, you're pushing outward, right? So with
Yeah.
pleasure, it's like
Yes.
it's here, it's
Yes.
me. With success, you're pushing it in time. With community, you're
Hmm.
pushing it out to other people. And then
Yes.
with moksha, it's like it's out to infinity.
It's yeah.
You're
Yeah. Yeah.
free.
No, that's a great way of putting it. It's a
Hmm.
great way of putting it.
Thanks. Yeah.
And it's all and also you're right. The way that you discuss it, or just explained it, it it's sort of, yeah, it's like what's really close to self, and then what's really farthest from
Hmm.
self,
Yep.
right? Right.
Yep. From ego, from
Because
like
even
here,
with worldly
body.
success, I still think it's a step up from just pure
Oh
selfish
yeah.
pleasure,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because you have to, you're, I would imagine some work needs to be done there, whereas with pure pleasure, you know,
Yeah, you have to do something.
I mean, you can get it immediately,
Hmm.
however you want, you know.
Especially nowadays. Maybe it was harder back then.
Yeah, right, true, true. Um, yeah, with that, sorry, there was another quote on page 21.
Hmm.
See, it was about renunciation. I thought it was really solid. Left-hand side, italicized, it says, "Your oh, this was, is that the one? Oh, yeah. This was I'll set it up. Sorry. When a man of the world praised an Indian ascetic for his powers of renunciation, the yogi responded, quote, "Your renunciation is far greater than mine, for I have renounced the finite for the infinite, whereas you are renouncing the infinite for the finite." If people could be satisfied by following their impulses, the thought of renunciation would never arise, right?
Yeah, that's crazy.
How could you actually renounce the infinite,
Yeah.
right? It seems almost, yeah, it seems like an absolute impossibility. Um,
You do it.
so
It's harder.
yeah,
Well, I
yeah,
don't.
yeah.
It's it's
So
it's funny because it's
go.
portrayed as if it's harder to renounce the infinite because it's like this bigger thing versus renouncing something that's finite. But
But
um,
actually, in
in
practice,
practice, it's the opposite because we're
yeah,
so bound and our experience is in the finite.
hmm
It's
yeah.
harder to let that go and experience and be with the
Let's
infinite.
tease that out a little bit.
Hmm.
Is it due? I would imagine in part it's due to the fact that I am that part of me, right? Because we'll talk about this when we talk about the Hindu notion of the self. We are at least bodies. We're more than that, but we're at least bodies. But even sticking there, um, I have senses that are ultimately connected to a nervous system that registers pleasure and pain from moment to moment,
Yeah.
right? So, so in other words, you can see at that level why I would like while pleasure immediately would be a concern, right? And we can see this even in infants, right? Um, I'm hungry.
It's necessary
I have a yeah, exactly.
for biology. Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah, exactly. I need love. I need food. I need to be clean. You know, all those things. And then you have that on repeat. So you have habituation,
Hmm.
right? Meaning that you're right. If I've repeated it, I'm going to want it. I'm going to want those things.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I feel is interesting too is that I'm with myself all the time, right?
That's funny.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
right, so I'm
No,
with
it's true.
myself all the time. I'm not out of body all the time. I'm not, I'm not. Um, I'm with myself all the time, and therefore, and my thoughts and those habituations. So it's very easy for me to focus on partner.
Hmm.
You with me? Whereas
Yeah. It's like all
it's
you know.
hard to, yeah, exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. Um, whereas then the difficulty is moving all the, ultimate, I mean, getting to duty is going to be tricky, or duty slash community.
Hmm.
And then even getting to the infinite is tricky as well. So I would say the way that we're constituted lends itself to first pleasure as a goal,
Yeah,
you
definitely.
know,
And I think,
and so so when you hear sort of, I don't know, like sort of the, typical, like, stop thinking about yourself all the time, stop being so selfish. I mean, that's true, but it's the same point. It's like, hey, this is difficult, you know.
yeah, I mean, I think it's
Um,
fundamental to like evolution. Like
yeah,
you look at other animal forms and they're totally based off of pleasure. It's
Yeah.
just like pain receptors, and
Yeah.
it's
All the
not.
pets you have, all the pets you have in your house.
Yeah, and
Right.
it's not until you're able to reflect on your own thoughts, right?
Hmm.
As humans are able to do, that you can kind of
Hmm.
push past that. And so,
Hmm.
I mean, I really feel like this. I'm trying to remember how this was portrayed. Like, were these paths parallel to one
I
another?
think you.
Because I was
Not.
I was a little confused
I think
because in the
some of them
beginning
do.
of this chapter it talks about the four paths of desire
Hmm.
and the two of desire and two of renunciation. But then
Hmm.
later it talks about the four yogas, which feel very different than
Yeah.
the four paths. Um,
Oh, the my sense of the is that what you meant in terms of are they parallel?
yeah, like can you, oh, I'm going to go down the path of pleasure. I'm going to go down the
Yeah.
path of community. Or is it like a journey that you go through all of them and they
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
go in the order that would
My
get
well,
you out?
that's interesting. I mean, what's interesting is with what it was saying about pleasure, just to get at the let's see, does at some point it said that these are not bad things,
Yeah, it does say
right?
that. Yeah.
These right.
I mean,
The
basically it says
past
you
here
shouldn't
in this
renun
section. But my sense was that these are not bad things. I
hmm
think though they're ultimately, like we said before, they're ultimately not going to be fulfilling,
Yeah,
right?
they're finite, limited.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So and my as when we just think about the four things people want, right?
yeah.
That we've been talking about, I could imagine one moving successively through them,
hmm
right? I could
Yeah,
also imagine someone getting stuck in one,
sure.
right? Or I could imagine maybe someone skipping one, like pleasure to duty,
hmm
maybe not doing the worldly success. Um, I think and obviously the, the sorry, the community slash duty, you're sort of getting now closer to uh, helping dissolve the ego,
hmm
right? And then obviously the infinite, you've arrived. So, um, but he says at one point that moksha or liberation, and he explains that liberation from everything that distances us from infinite being,
hmm
infinite awareness, and infinite bliss. So the so basically, I mean, pleasure is not going to get there. Worldly success isn't get there. Duty fully won't get there.
Right.
They'll all be sort of in the way. And then the yogas, the four paths, these are this is how to arrive at this liberation,
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
liberated from pleasure, to be liberated from just worldly success,
yeah.
right? um, so I would imagine the I would imagine someone could go right through all the four things,
hmm
right, developmentally. Some don't, some get stuck, and we'll get to this later, but you're going to have the reincarnation idea with this religion. So if you
hmm
get stuck, well, you'll come back around and have to have to work on that part again, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also seeing parallels now that I think about it to a later part of the
To the
chapter where it talks about life and moving through
mhm.
student, marriage,
Mm,
retirement, renunciation,
right.
and that kind of
Yes.
parallels these these
You think
these
the
paths.
yogas too?
I don't think I think the yogas are. I think that's different because those are
Oh,
four different paths that you can take.
yeah.
Whereas
These are the
the
tools for liberation.
right, right, but like student, um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would say that student is maybe that's getting out of pleasure and into more of success.
Yeah.
Like you're doing
Yeah.
your thing,
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
accomplishments, and then
Yeah.
when you get to marriage and you're devoting your time to family and vocation and
Hmm.
civic duty, then that's bringing you into community duty, path of
Yeah.
renunciation. But then it isn't until after you retire and in their form of retirement, they apparently go to the forest to know oneself,
Yeah,
right? Like separate.
yeah, yeah,
And then finally,
yeah.
the fourth stage, which is after retirement, when they've kind of philosophized and done that, um,
Mm-hmm,
they call those people, was it sannyasin, it looked like? Um,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and at that point, I assume they've either reached moksha or something close to it, where they can at least
Right.
distinguish their true self from their finite self,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
which is
mm-hmm.
very
No,
interesting. So,
I
yeah.
can see that. I can see that.
Hmm.
That the yeah the yeah the four things people want connected to those stages,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And
Right.
I would imagine too that I mean, one of the next section after it talks about those four desire things people want, goes on to the limitations of that, and then it talks about
Mm-hmm,
reincarnation a little bit. But I would go on to say that those stages, like if you are
mm-hmm.
to progress them to get farther and farther from yourself out to liberation, to moksha,
Yeah.
that is not that's not limited to one lifetime. Like in one lifetime, you might
Correct.
only be focused on pleasure the entire time.
Mm-hmm,
And then
mm-hmm,
it's not until
mm-hmm.
a later lifetime where you kind of liberate from pleasure and then it's a
Yeah.
success. And it's not
Yeah.
until a later life. And maybe some people do go through,
Yeah.
all four in a
Yeah.
or maybe, it's probably
That
not
that'll be
linear.
interesting as we sort of tap into the notion of reincarnation about how that works. Like, is it
Hmm.
the case that you can have a savant like first birth,
Hmm.
that just gets there, right, in
I
that
think
one
so.
lifetime,
I think
or
so.
right?
I think it actually
Yeah.
mentioned that near the end. I'd have to look it up, but I think it
Yeah.
talks about like the different journeys that people take, and
Hmm. Hmm.
um, there was
And
the
then
knowledge,
the yeah.
the tree. What was it?
Yes.
You remember that story at the very end? And there was one
You're gonna have
kid
to
who did
remind me.
not. Oh, let me find it.
Oh.
Uh,
No, I think I do. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kicking around. It's kicking around. Was it in the world
Many
section?
paths to the same
Welcome to the
summit, I
world.
think. Or no, no, that was different. That was, or was it? Um, The World, Welcome and Farewell. Was it that one?
Remember the
Um,
tree story. Oh, actually, funny, I think I remember where the tree story is. Like on what
oh,
page,
here it
what
is,
side?
page 50. Yeah, Coming
Okay,
of Age
okay.
in the Universe, 49 and 50. So that's when it talks about jiva, which is a
Oh,
soul, right?
hmm,
An
hmm.
individual soul that can live through multiple human embodied lives.
Right.
Um, but yeah, on page 50, it talks about, was it the Kalpataru or
Kalpa, Kalpatoru. Yeah.
Kalpataru? Um,
Oh, that fulfills all the wishes. Right.
yeah, yeah, it's like the wishing tree. Is that what
Yeah.
was?
Yeah. If you speak to it and tell it a wish, the wish will be granted.
Yeah, yeah, there it is.
Right.
The old man, yeah, yeah. And then it mentions, at once the children rush to the tree and start showering it with requests. Um, but the Kalpataru grants them indiscriminately. It has no interest in giving advice. Years pass and it's forgotten. Children now grown into men and women, are trying to fulfill new wishes they have found. Um, Point of the story is that the universe is one gigantic wishing tree with branches that reach into every heart. The cosmic process decrees that some time or other, in this life or another, each of these wishes will be granted, together, of
Hmm.
course, with consequences.
With
And then it
consequences.
says,
Right.
there was one child from the original group, however, the story concludes, who did not spend his years skipping from desire to desire, from one gratification to
Hmm.
another. For from the first he had understood the real nature of the wishing tree. For him, Kalpataru was not the pretty magic tree of his uncle's story. It did not exist to grant the foolish wishes of children. It was unspeakably terrible and grand. It was his father and his mother. Its roots held the world together, and its branches reached beyond the stars. Before the beginning, it had been and always would be. So there's one kid who didn't.
So he got it.
He got
He
it.
got it fast. He
Yeah,
got it fast. Yeah. So yeah.
in that
Um,
story. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, you can get it fast, or it can take. a series of incarnations, a series of lives ultimately to break out.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the uh, yogas,
Okay.
shall we?
Yeah, let's yeah.
Right.
So we have four
And
yogas.
maybe we should mention this first. So Hindu
Hmm.
anthropology has the notion that we have a body, we have a personality, which is our
Yeah.
consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, this was brought up at this point, but in the Raja Yoga, it went down a level to
Yeah.
subconscious, um, and
Subconscious and then
then
finally being. I drew a
yeah,
diagram. It'll be
exactly.
reversed,
Oh,
but it's
excellent! It
just
will be in
like
reverse because of the video.
yeah. Um,
Oh, up at the top.
yep.
Love it.
So
Oh, there
it's
you go. Wow,
body,
wow.
consciousness, subconsciousness, and then just like a
There you
vast
go. There you go.
being.
Exactly.
Oops.
And I guess Atman then is sort of like the I don't know where we fit that in, but it's the self. I know
Yeah.
that Atman is the self, but and the classic line within Hinduism is Atman is Brahman, and
Hmm.
Brahman is the supreme being, um, you know, infinite, infinity itself, right?
Yeah.
Or
Hmm.
if you will, God. So we have
Yeah.
clearly we can say this falls into the category of pantheism, right? That everything is.
Hmm.
I
Or
would, I
is it pan
believe
or
everything.
panenthean? Panentheism or
I'm not sure. Pantheism would be that everything is God. So that would that would go beyond
hmm.
humans.
Hmm.
That
And
would
what
go
was
beyond humans. That would be matter itself.
okay. Hmm. And then what was
Right? Matter
panentheism?
itself. I'd have to look that up.
Okay. Yeah.
That's I don't know if that's God outside that is somehow in at the same time.
Hmm. Like
Note
there's a
to self.
separateness or
I'm gonna. I'll have to look that up. So I'm sorry. The anthropology is important. Um, uh, because the final goal is liberation. The final goal is realizing what you really are,
hmm.
or as um, uh, yeah, yeah. Sorry, I was trying to think of another quote that just slipped. So so we've got the problem in terms of the path of desire. Um,
Yep. Well, there's
we have
also
an
three
anthropology.
limitations or strictures, right?
Yeah, go
That
for it.
that prevent you from getting to liberation. And those
Right.
are limitations on joy, knowledge, and being.
Oh, exactly. I
Hmm.
have that written. Go for it.
That's all I wrote.
Oh,
I
that's fine.
don't I don't
So
remember the
the
exact
limitations,
details. Yeah.
well, the limitations were um, with joy, knowledge, and being.
Yeah.
We've got what's the limit? The limit would be various forms of pain that we experience limit us from experiencing joy.
Hmm.
By the way, he uses joy. I think bliss is another one that's commonly used.
Okay. Hmm.
So types of pain that would be physical pain, but that could also be psychological pain. That could be on we he even mentions, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's right.
those things can be barriers. Um, full knowledge, a barrier would be forms of ignorance. So forms of ignorance would be being stuck on pleasure, being stuck on worldly success, thinking that you are only an individual atavistic ego,
Hmm.
right? And then limitations on being. So well, I guess that's sort of connected, right? Seeing yourself only as finite when you're infinite,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So right, so you put all those together, right? Because you're right, you've got and actually, I guess you could, Krishna, I think the four things: pleasure, worldly success, duty, and then moksha or the infinite,
Hmm.
are connected to these limitations, right?
Yeah. It's definitely. Yeah.
Right. So, in other words, too much pleasure, or the wrong forms of pleasure, the pleasure that ultimately brings about pain, let's say, will keep you from joy or bliss,
Hmm.
and then you can work it out. Um, knowledge
Or it
would be a
prevents you
good one
from gaining
too.
knowledge, right? Like it could
Yeah,
indulging in pleasure prevents you
there
from
you go.
being more outside of yourself. Like maybe you are fulfilling joy, but you can't because you're fulfilling joy so much you're not able to fulfill knowledge or being.
That's fair.
Hmm.
That's fair. Exactly. Exactly. So then it gets into the four paths to the ultimate goal,
Yeah.
and that's where we get the word yoga from, which ultimately means yoke or a form of uniting integration union.
Hmm. Yep.
Um, and a classic yoke, tying two things together. Um, and then we get into the multiple paths to God, which I, for shorthand, I mean, got it from the book, but shorthand, reflective, emotional,
Hmm.
active, energetic, big
Hmm.
one, and then experimental.
Yep. And those are the
Um,
different, they call them bents for people's like personalities.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
and obviously that lends itself, right? I mean, as I would say, an attractive feature
Hmm.
for the religion, right?
Oh
It,
yeah,
it, it
definitely.
it's not a one size fits all. It's
Hmm.
probably, well, you know this too, right? With the, forget what those tests are called. What do you call those?
Oh,
The
personality tests.
emotional person. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
right. You could probably whatever the categories are, you could probably fit them within these four
Maybe.
mostly.
Yeah. I mean, it breaks down more than that, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know like one's introspective, so you could probably put that into reflective, possibly,
Yeah, I
or
mean,
when it
if you're talking about like MBTI, then there's 16 categories instead of
okay.
four. Excuse me.
Oh.
So for
I'll let you
you,
draw that diagram for next time.
you might be able to put four into each category,
Sure.
or this is another layer on top of that, and that's more of
Yeah.
like a personality trait, whereas this
Yeah.
reflective, I don't know, I feel like they might align somewhat. Um, but
Yes.
like these
So
bents
reflective,
would be on
emotional,
top of that
yeah,
as their like dimension.
active, energetic, and experimental.
Yeah.
So I think it lends itself, right, because it's almost sort of like um, this is interesting because I think when we look, so we do a little bit of comparative here. I think when you look at the world religions, you're not going to always find multiple paths. I
Hmm.
mean, there's going to be variety, right? So, like for instance, within the Catholic tradition, you're going to have people that are, um, the what they call the religious, right? So, a priest who's dedicating his life to a parish,
Hmm.
um, monks, nuns, right? Not all are called to that,
Right.
right? And then some would be more called to what we would call like the householder in
Hmm.
the in this book, right? So you could sort of see that there's sort of a variety of how you want to be placed within that tradition,
Hmm.
but it's a little bit different
It's not
because
as
these are
explicit.
actual paths,
Yeah.
right? Those
Yeah.
are roles. These are actual paths, right?
Hmm.
Um, Whereas within, and we'll get to Judaism, so I'm not sure. My sense within Judaism, Christianity, Islam is more of a here is what is to be believed, right? That is static,
Hmm.
right? And there's not going to be variation,
Right.
right? That here is the truth. Um, and, and 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 I guess when it comes to like the metaphysic of Hinduism, that won't vary. That will be also pretty static, right?
Yeah.
But the approach to it
Hmm.
is it's almost like customized,
Yeah. Many paths to
right?
God.
Yeah. So um, so I found that interesting because I feel like that's relatively unique
Hmm.
um, compared to my understanding of the Western religions.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean,
Um,
I think you see this concept in some other things. Like, for example, I was reading Spong's A New Christianity for a New World, and he kind of has that same
mhm,
idea that you can approach like this idea of God through
mhm,
different ways, and those different ways can be,
mhm.
from his perspective, different religions.
Yeah,
They all get you to the same idea of an ineffable like being and like coming to some
sure.
order like understanding of that. But
Hmm.
every person has a different path to that. And his is more meta, right? Like this is like these are the different paths, and they're a bit more laid out within Hinduism.
Right,
But his is more
right.
meta in that it doesn't really matter which religion you go
Yeah,
down, you end up at the same
exactly.
place.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Although it was saying at some point that I think early on, Smith was saying that within Hinduism, there really is no sense of exclusivity,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're right.
right?
You're right. Hmm.
Right, with like that, so in other words, it could well, I'll have to go back to that section, but is it the case that the Hindu is going to be looking at the Christian or the Muslim being like, well, that is your particular, path,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, thought one of the interesting sort of preliminaries for all of the yogas, all four of the yogas, was, as he puts it, dismantling of bad habits and the acquisition of good ones.
Hmm.
So the bad habits were, I mentioned this at the beginning, these are basic principles I think we'll find in a lot of the religions: non-injury, truthfulness, non-stealing, self-control, cleanliness, contentment, self-discipline.
Hmm.
So it's almost sort of like a prerequisite that
Yeah.
you have to have these things in place in order, essentially, for the path really to work, or to clear, if you will, the
Hmm.
path.
It's interesting that those are only brought up specifically, again, at least from um, Houston's perspective.
Hmm.
Those are only brought up specifically in the Raja Yoga, right?
Yeah.
Like you
Yes.
have like
Yes. I
those are
saw. I noticed that.
requirements to get to
Yeah.
the next level
Yeah.
of experimentation in Raja
Yeah.
Yoga, but they're not like they're not specifically brought up in the other three yogas.
The
So I thought that
others.
was
Yeah.
interesting. Maybe
Yeah.
there's less of a focus on it. Maybe they just kind of come
Yeah.
by doing. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But he did say all of them need it,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That was on page 26. He was like, the first step of every yoga involves those,
Yeah.
right? But you're right. The fact that it's reiterated, and also too, he gives 3 pages to Raja Yoga, which
Yeah.
must mean, you know, well, he calls it the royal road, but maybe
Hmm.
it's like, man, you really need to have these these
Yeah.
moral principles in place.
More
Um,
important.
yeah.
Even
Um,
though he says
so
that the jnana, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the jnana
no
yoga,
J. No,
yeah,
it's no J.
is no J.
You don't pronounce the J.
Oh, nana,
Jnana.
jnana. Okay, yeah, so,
Jnana.
okay. The jnana yoga, which is the focus on knowledge, the way to God through knowledge. He says
Hmm.
that that is the hardest, like the steepest path, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the shortest path to oneness with God. Whereas you look at even the
Wait a minute.
Raja,
He did say it was the shortest one,
yeah, the shortest path, but the
but
steepest.
the most difficult. Interesting.
Yeah, where was this? I think it
Around
was it on
27, I
20, yeah,
guess.
somewhere on 27.
It's probably. It's there somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take your word for it.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, the so jnana yoga, um reflective bent, path,
Hmm.
the way to God through knowledge is the title of that section.
Hmm.
Um and
I got,
so
I got the, and then he talks about the 3 stages, right? In this particular path.
yeah. Where
So
is this?
the first one is, well, first one, it's all in there. We got through knowledge. 3 stages, left hand column,
Hmm.
middle of that column.
Oh yeah, yep,
So
yep.
the three were
Hmm.
hearing, thinking, and he didn't really give it a name for the third one, but it was shifting your identity. You could say shifting your identity. Um, so hearing would be relying on the sages and
Hmm.
the Hindu scriptures, right? So you're first hearing, then you're reflecting upon what you're hearing, but also upon yourself. So this is where we start thinking about using the word my. We use the word my a lot. And when I do that, then I'm reinforcing the fact that
I'm separate.
I, yeah,
Like
exactly,
from
right.
something that I own, but then you also talk
Yep,
about my body or like my face, and it's like, well, are you actually
right.
different from those things?
Yeah, yeah, you're separate, you're atomized, right. Um, and then the other one too was about change and permanence, right? So if it's the case that everything in me physically changes over time,
Hmm.
yet I'm the same person, what is that abiding part, right?
Right.
And the Hindu take would obviously be that would be the Atman Brahman connection, right?
Yeah.
And then and then it was shifting identification with one's abiding shifting identification with one's abiding part. So from me or from ego or from persona, ultimately to the infinite.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it is just entirely an intellectual approach,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Right. It's all cognitive, I mean, to a degree. Yeah, it all is. You're hearing words, you're thinking reflection, and then you're doing a mental shift. It's funny.
Yeah.
I thought, given my bent to things intellectual, that would be the one I would choose. But I actually think I'd choose the experimental one.
Hmm.
Um, uh,
Yeah. I mean, as I was reading it, yeah, I said reflective bent, and I was like,
mhm.
that's probably me. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and it probably is. But
yeah,
reading the other ones, it's like, I don't know. They all feel different, right?
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, obviously, it talks about it. There's not just you don't just take one path. You do
Right.
multiple, and so that probably
Right.
makes
Well,
the most
actually, the
sense.
bhakti, I'm sorry, the karma yoga was the most interesting one in terms of the inclusion of the jnana and
Yeah,
bhakti.
yeah. It
That
kind
I
of said
thought
that there are
I
two
had to do a
flavors.
reread there. I
Hmm.
was like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah,
Um, but I would imagine that someone could do the jnana yoga solely,
yeah, yeah.
you
I
know,
mhm.
um, depending on their proclivities. I can see a lot. I can see bhakti yoga being done by probably a lot of
That's
people.
what I was
I
thinking.
mean,
There's probably more
I'm
people
sort
in
of
that
thinking,
category.
yeah, I'm thinking of sort of the Hindu grandma, sort of
Hmm.
a stereotypical Hindu grandma, whatever that is. It's probably not doing the jnana yoga,
Hmm.
but the bhakti. I would imagine the bhakti and the karma are really would be really common,
Hmm.
because it's very easy to. What am I sorry? Not sorry. If you have an emotional bent, then it's very easy to devote yourself to the love of God.
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, here's
and
it says it on.
yeah.
That's why I couldn't find it.
Oh,
It says it on the first paragraph to for the Bhakti one. It says
okay.
the
What
yoga of
does it say?
knowledge is said to be the shortest path to divine realization, but also the
I got it.
steepest. And
There
then
we go.
and then it
Okay,
talks
got
about
it.
Bhakti, which is less steep of a path.
Yeah, the yoga of love.
Love and devotion.
Yeah. So that one seems. We mentioned that earlier in the video. I think for sake of time, maybe we should talk about the bhakti and then the karma, and then we'll pick up with the raja next time. Does that
Sure.
sound good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, I thought with the bhakti yoga, um, I think they even say it, it's interesting. Well, no, but the difference with jnana is that jnana insists on God's otherness.
Jnana
I'm sorry, no,
insists
no, no,
on
no, no,
yeah,
no,
yeah,
no. It's a flip. I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah,
Bhakti insists on God's otherness
yeah.
in order to love it,
Hmm.
right? Which is different than the jnana one, which is all about breaking down that barrier between self and its infinite, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so it's not to identify with God, but to adore God.
Hmm.
Um, question I sort of had is we referenced this earlier. It's like, does that um, what there's a principle in Catholic theology called oh God, can I get the Latin right? I think it's lex orandi, lex credendi, which is the law of prayer is the law of belief.
Hmm.
And forget the law part, but the way you, it's basically saying it's the way that you run mass, the way that you run your liturgy or your worship service says something about what you believe, right?
Hmm.
So uh, I just we're going back to this doesn't identify with God, but to adore God. Does that practice end up in the mind of the of this yogi create a separateness. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm,
Like in other words, the whole approach is I am loving God, this thing outside of me,
right.
right? And
Yeah.
I can keep all of my love and adoration on God, but does that betray the deeper Hindu metaphysic of the connection between the individual and God? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah, no, I get you. I feel like this kind of goes to the idea, this is later in the chapter, but the idea of the Saguna Brahman and the Nirguna Brahman, which is one is
Mm-hmm.
God with attributes and one is God without attributes. And so
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think that the Bhakti yoga would focus on the God with attributes because that is something that you
Easily.
can love, right? And
Right.
it's so much
Right.
easier to think about. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the jnana yoga or yogi would focus on the Saguna Brahman, which
Without
is with, or no, not
without
Saguna, the
attribute.
Nirgana Brahman, which is God without attributes.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think it even talks about, no, maybe it's in this section later, where it's the difference of looking at the ocean as like this
Yeah.
vast sea and removing all of the crests. And it's just like infinite oneness, no attributes. Like you keep talking about trying to
Sure.
define God, and you just say it is not this, it's not this, it's not this, until you get to
Yeah.
whatever you end up with. God is, because you can't describe him, it's
Yeah.
ineffable. But then um, the Saguna Brahman, God with attributes, is is the infinite, is the ocean, but with crests and peaks and something to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I would say that
No, that's fair. I
they're
think there's a
like
good connection.
it's the same, it's the same underlying metaphysic idea, but the approach is different, right? The one
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
approaching something that is an object, but that object
Yeah.
kind of brings you to being able to love, right? And
Yeah.
through that path of
Yeah.
God. And the other one is to try to de-objectify, right? Kind of
Sure.
depersonalize and
Yeah.
focus
Yeah.
on the attributeless God.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
still the same concept. It's just about
Mm-hmm.
the approach. It's just a facade of getting to
Mm-hmm.
the same
Mm-hmm.
concept.
Mm-hmm. Which would seem to speak to the needs of the aspirant, right?
Yeah.
It
Hmm.
would, or their constitution, their personality,
Yeah.
right? Right. So, in other words, it could be the case that the bhakti, the practitioner of the bhakti, is just like I don't get the jnana.
Yeah. No, I think
I
so.
can't do that. I can't. it's just I don't. I can't even. I can't get my mind around it.
Hmm.
This I can do. This is concrete.
Yeah.
Um, and I would say that, like I said before, the effect, and it just dawned on me, the effect of it, the effect of pouring all your love out on God does turn you away from yourself.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it has the same effect,
Hmm.
right? Um, of not just like I'm not selfish, but if I am turning away from myself, then I guess I'm. How did he put it? Wow, this was so good. This was great. The human project is to clean one's chimney to allow the light within to radiate with full display, right?
Hmm.
So this is a way of cleaning your chimney. The jnana yoga is cleaning the chimney through hearing, thinking, reflection, and then the bhakti is through ultimately directing his her gaze on God.
Hmm.
So that makes sense to me. All right, we'll wrap up with karma. You want to take the lead there?
Yeah.
Karma yoga,
So
sorry.
karma, yeah, karma yoga, which karma I think literally means work,
Work.
which
Yeah.
it's talked about later, karma in a different context, which is more of like cause and effect. Um,
Right.
but yeah, so this is the way to God through work. And what was interesting about it was that, it, so this is for the energetic bent, right? People who
Hmm.
are,
Hmm.
it's about like they're active,
Active, energetic.
energetic. The interesting thing about this one is that they, there's kind of two approaches within this path. and
Hmm.
they are the two that we already talked about, the jnana or
Can I
yeah.
mention something right before that?
Hmm.
So just to be clear, so you working ways that carry you to God. That's the
Yeah.
general
Hmm.
before this breakdown you're going to talk about. Um, and and then he talks about if I work for my own benefit, I'm building up ego.
Yeah.
If I'm doing work that is selfless, that brings me closer to God, right? So those are
Hmm.
some general principles before he does these subsets,
Yeah. Hmm.
right?
And then yeah, so these subsets, which are the jnana and the bhakti, um, which
I called it like karma bhakti and
yeah,
karma
karma and jnana,
jnana
yeah, yeah.
with a hyphen.
Hmm. So the karma yoga with the jnana focus
Hmm.
is about distancing yourself through your work, right? And
Right.
it's kind of like focusing on the bigger picture of what's
Hmm.
happening, distancing yourself, like you are the tool, the instrument that God is
Hmm.
using essentially
Hmm.
to do the work. Um,
Yeah.
whereas the um, the karma yoga with the bhakti focus is more focusing on the labor of love that you're doing, right? So it's not it's not like
Hmm.
using, it's not like distancing yourself from
Right.
like the personal aspects of it, but it's more of like
Sure.
pouring your love into what you're actually doing,
Yeah.
into your
Yeah.
work and into the people around you.
Or I'm doing this work for
Yeah,
God.
for God. Like
Right.
I'm
Right.
executing it on his behalf, and
Right.
that is my love
Right.
to him. Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, I thought that was great. But
Hmm.
yeah, whereas like it almost seems like what is it? I think Paul somewhere says like it is not I who does this, but Christ through me,
Yep.
right? Right?
Yep.
Which
Yep.
sounds more like the karma jnana, right? It's
Hmm.
just this is just I am I don't want to say a tool, but whatever. I am a
Instrument.
tool. I'm an instrument um, of the supreme being,
Hmm.
and and I'm divorcing this notion of that I'm doing this, at all. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's almost it almost seems like you could one way of imaging having an image for it is like with the bhakti yoga, God's out here and work, and I'm here with my work toward God, whereas
Hmm.
God is sort of behind me with the jnana form,
Hmm.
right,
Yeah.
pushing, doing the work through me, you
Yeah. Yep.
know. So
You were just
all
one of
right,
the crests of the wave of being.
exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't I ask one final question,
Hmm.
and then we'll stop. And then, as we said, we'll pick up with the Raja Yoga and the rest of this chapter.
Hmm.
Um, what was sort of the big takeaway for you in
The
reading this? Had you had much exposure to Hinduism before?
Not really, not the
Okay.
details. It was pretty vague. So I definitely learned a lot reading this chapter, and I loved it. I read it twice, so I could really. Yeah, I think the some of the terms are, I mean, they're not our words, so it's harder to like have
Sure.
concepts for them. So going through a
Hmm.
second time and actually like jotting down notes helped a lot to give pictures to those ideas. Um, but yeah, no, I don't. I think, before reading this, I didn't like. I had like a pretty vague
Hmm.
like stereotypical concept of
Yeah. Yeah.
Hinduism. But like seeing this, it's very, very interesting, and I like how personalized it is, and it's not just in um, what we've read. I've seen a little bit from, I watched Dr. K on YouTube, and he's a doctor, but he also was a yogi, and he talks about oh, what's it called? Like Ayurveda there
Hmm.
is like the Hinduism
Yep.
form of medication essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and even within that, they talk about the different elements of people, and it's very
Hmm.
personalized.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
think that's definitely something that seeing it in the kind of spiritual religious practices is interesting. It's like permeated throughout their culture is that things are very personalized to individual people.
Yeah.
Um, and I like that. I think I think it makes sense. People are different, and you can't deny that.
Yeah. 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 No, that's good. That's good. That's good. It. for me, so it'd been a while since,
Hmm.
you know, things were popping back up because I taught comparative religions, never a Hindu scholar, but a number of times. And um, so things, so I was like, oh, that's right, this idea. Oh, that's right, this path, so on and so forth. But I too connect with you on and I guess I've always known this, but haven't really thought about it recently. But that same point of recognizing differences within the human population, and that therefore, if one is going to arrive at ultimate truth, let's say,
Hmm.
um, it will be it will be in a certain way that will respect their personality and identity. You
Hmm.
know, so that part is really attractive, and then the other one too is the I mean, we don't really get this till the Raja, which we can talk about next time,
Hmm.
but we read it, and that was just and by I should qualify this too. I'm reading some personal development books on my 75-day challenge, and so I've been thinking, and there's the one on how to break up with your phone. Um, talk brings up mindfulness,
Hmm.
and so it's made me think a little bit more about you know uh, including meditation as a form of mindfulness, and literally just as a form of slowing down, you
Hmm.
know, and starting to think about my breath, and mind, etc. Uh, so yeah, sort of. I had a meditation practice at one point, and possibly return to it.
Yeah.
So good.
Cool. Yeah.
All
I
right.
think just to add one
Yeah.
last thought, um, I think the aspect of how personal this religion is
Hmm.
I feel like it's pretty stark from my experience of Christianity growing up,
Oh my God.
which was very, this is the only way, right?
Yeah.
And it's very exclusive of others. And I
Hmm.
always had, like, personally, I always had issues with um, the idea that there are different ways to do Christianity. Like,
Hmm.
growing up, that's how I felt. Um, like, I don't know. It like the religion feels like you need to be an evangelist, right?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of
Yeah.
the religion. That's what you got to
Yeah.
do. And so
The Great Commission.
when you see people who are not being evangelists, and it's like, oh, but they're still a Christian. They just go to church or they just
Yeah.
live in their community. It's like, are you really?
Right.
Like, are you really
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
the work of God? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so I don't know. I feel like it's not really taught the way that
Hmm.
Hinduism is taught, where it's like
Yeah.
there are so many different
Yeah.
ways to do God's work, essentially, or
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
approach God. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that's just the church, or
Hmm.
if that's also how it's written, like
Hmm.
if the Bible doesn't actually talk about different ways to do his work.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that just that's something that will be interesting to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
No,
mean, you'd
I
mentioned like the
agree.
different roles and like I think, that exists, but it's the
Yeah.
way that it's taught in church and
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
passages that are referenced
Yeah.
make it seem
Yeah.
like the only thing that should matter is the Great Commission. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing that's going to be distinct between, since we're on Christianity, we'll take that
Hmm.
Christianity and Hinduism is Christianity, in addition to, and its various forms, right? The Protestant form, the Catholic form, the Orthodox form, the Eastern Orthodox form. Um, it's creedal. It's
Hmm.
about belief, right?
Hmm.
It's about what you believe and whether or not you have orthodoxy, correct belief, right
Hmm.
belief. So a lot of the premium is put on that, and that's also and I'm sorry, you could include that the Great Commission, as it were, and making converts is wrapped up in that,
Hmm.
right? Right. This is part of what we believe we should do. um, so that's a massive distinction. I mean, you don't have a creed.
Yeah.
You don't have you don't have a anything that's close to an Apostles' Creed or a Nicene Creed in Hinduism.
Hmm.
Uh, you have, in fact, when we start reading their scriptures, they're vast, and probably, and also their importance. I'm imagining is going to be far more varied than the canon.
Right.
That
Hmm.
so it's fun. I feel like the door that's being opened for both religions is it's just a different door that sets the stage
Hmm.
and colors everything thereafter. You know,
Right.
I mean, belief matters. That belief ultimately, for Christianity, and belief ultimately determines whether or not you're in or out.
Hmm.
You know, and I I'm not getting that from this.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that's well, yeah, we'll have to continue to explore that.
Yeah, definitely.
Good. All right.
Cool.
Well, until next time.
Until next time.
All right.
And